Hello my loves, welcome back to my channel. I have finally finished Iron Flame, is what it's called, yeah. I finally finished it, and so today I want to give you my full, unfiltered opinions on the Empyrean series. Before we start, a few disclaimers. Firstly, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing Empyrean correctly. I looked it up beforehand, but there was a lot of conflicting guides on how to say it, and the only reason I bring that up is because in a previous video I have called out Rebecca Yarros, the author of this series, for mispronouncing Gaelic words. So, you know, I can't really do that if I am then also mispronouncing the name of her series. But that's how I think you say it, so that's how I'm going to keep saying it. Another disclaimer, and I suppose the main one, I appreciate that everyone is entitled to their own thoughts, opinions, views, whatever on books. This is entirely just mine. And if you already know that you like this series and you're gonna read more of it, you enjoyed the characters, anything, and you don't think your mind's going to ever change on that, this video probably isn't for you, because my opinions are probably going to be very different, and that's okay, because we're all allowed to have different opinions. If you're trying to work out whether this series is worth reading and you want to hear different opinions, or you're not sure how you feel about it, you might be more open to what I have to say. Also, I just realised I didn't notice, I don't know how well you can see it on camera, but if you could notice two like red marks under my eyebrows, that is because I was doing my eyebrows yesterday, and for some reason the wax that I use and have been using for a very long time decided to just rip my skin off. So if you can see two red marks, that is why. So firstly, if you have missed out on the massive hype and following behind these books, Fourth Wing, the first book in the series, was published last year and immediately sort of took off. I remember so many people talking about it when it first came out and so much hype being around it, being a fantastic fantasy book. Iron Flame came out towards the end of last year, which is the second book in the series, and this is scheduled, I think, to be 5 books in total in this series, which deeply annoyed me because I thought it was only a duology and then I would be done with it. But no. I would call it fantasy romance. I wouldn't just call it fantasy. It's very much your Sarah J Maas fantasy. Yeah, that kind of... The romance is a very strong element on it, so more of that, I suppose, romantasy fear, in my opinion. It's set in a fantasy land where dragons are real and there are multiple different avenues you can take in terms of jobs. I'm going to be completely honest, I don't really understand the world fully, which is a point I will come to later. But a big part of this is the armed forces, and within the armed forces they have just regular sort of infantry, ground army, and then they have the riders. The riders have to go to a specific war college. They go through specific trials and tribulations in the hopes of bonding a dragon and then going into war afterwards with this dragon. They will also then be able to draw power and magic, and they will have certain abilities depending on which dragon they bond. And the whole thing is very dangerous. A lot of people die during this college experience, and it's supposed to sort of harden you for the war. So we start in Fourth Wing with Violet Sorengale. Is that her last name? I don't remember. We're just gonna call her Violet. Violet does not want to be a rider. Violet is described by herself as very frail. Her bones break easily, things dislocate and pop out of sockets. She's not the sturdiest, and she's always wanted to be a scribe, which is what her dad was. Her dad's dead.
It was left to me by my dad. The dad that's dead. My father's dead. I have a dead father.
But her mum is the general in the armed forces. So she decides that Violet's going to go to the war college instead, and that is essentially where the story picks off, is Violet being forced into this different path and being forced to overcome all the challenges that come with her trying to make it in a school that is designed to weed out the weak cadets, essentially. My notes, my description of this was, think The Hunger Games meets ACOTAR meets a pile of shit. just if early gates you want to know my thoughts on this series. So I have already briefly talked about Fourth Wing as a book in my, I think it was my last wrap up of the year, and I talked a bit about the problems with Rebecca Yarros in there as well, which I've decided I'm not going to talk about today because I've already talked about it, and I kind of just want to talk about the problems with the books themselves. If you want to know my opinions on that, that is in, like I said, my previous video, one of my previous videos. Fourth Wing, just on its own, just taking it as a book on its own, I'll hold my hands up and say it's not terrible. It wasn't great, and it wasn't something that I particularly would probably have thought about again after reading it, but it wasn't awful. In my opinion, it was a 3-star book. That is why I rated it, and that is kind of what it feels like. The first part of it was very frustrating for me. It felt very dated in how it approached fantasy and the characters. It felt like it should have been written in 2012. With the female main character complaining that she's really weak, but then getting annoyed when anyone else mentions it when they're trying to help her, but then somehow being able to do everything and overcome every challenge thrown at her despite the fact that really she shouldn't be able to do that, to a love triangle, dangerous place where you're supposed to die. It just felt very 2012 fantasy, and what I felt like we had moved forward from. Although I'll be completely honest, I don't really read that much fantasy anymore, actually, thinking about it. I could be wrong and we could still be there, but me reading it now very much felt like this is something I would have read as a teenager and it would have fitted in perfect with that territory. That is another problem for a later date though. Fourth Wing is very much just like setting foundations, I suppose. It's introducing you to the world. It's introducing you to this college and the way things are structured in terms of the political landscape in a way, and also generally the armed forces and problems within or between different territories in this fantasy world. I think it was a good attempt, but I don't think it was amazing, in that I know with any fantasy book that you start reading, you're going to be confused for a while, you're not going to know where places are, you're not going to remember the name of everything. But typically you pick it up over time and you get used to these things. Take Shadow and Bone, for example. Lots of different countries, different factions of people, but after 3 books that were considerably shorter than these two, I was with it. It was fine. These are incredibly long, and by the end of the first book I still didn't really understand the political structure, the living situations of this place. Part of that might be because Violet has always sort of lived in the army places, but she also is someone who values history. Her dad was a scribe, she wanted to be a scribe documenting history, so you would expect there to be more information, but they're just, I don't feel like there was enough, so you're still left quite confused by what's going on. And that's why at the beginning when I said there's different jobs that people can do and I was a bit confused, it's because you don't really know what general people do. You're never told. You're never really told about anything outside of this college, and it just then makes things a bit more confusing or leaves the world not really feeling that fleshed out. You would expect the first book to be doing that, to you know, explain these things and set you in this world, but I just didn't really feel like it did. I also didn't really feel like the characters were I don't know how to put into words what I mean, but the characters just felt like there was attempts at development that kind of happened, but then when we move into Iron Flame, it all just goes back again. The characters are kind of irritating, in my opinion. I don't really like any of the characters. By the end of Fourth Wing, I was maybe a bit more like, okay, towards Violet, but generally Violet is incredibly irritating as a main character, which is not great because you're in her head all the time. Some of her friends from the college are better, but they're just background characters that aren't really there very often. And then the main love interest is just the same as every other male love interest in fantasy stories these days. I'm sorry, but he is. He has dark hair, he can wield shadows, he wears black all the time, he's dangerous and protective. He's the same as every single male love interest in every other fantasy series. And I think that's the thing that I felt when I was reading Fourth Wing, is that none of this feels particularly original. And I appreciate it's very hard to write an original piece of fiction where there's no influences from anything else, there's no ideas borrowed or things that other people have written that you haven't even realised that they've written. But this literally just felt like the exact same as every other fantasy story that blows up on TikTok. My general feelings were, this isn't awful, this isn't great, but it wasn't that difficult to read, so I'll probably read more of it, which is not the best review, but it's not the worst. Then we move on to Iron Flame, which... oh, I hated this book. Oh, I hated it so much. So firstly, I have just a little bit of personal beef with this book. I wanted to start 2024 reading a specific book. I wanted it to set the pace for the year, be inspirational. I wanted to read Letters to a Young Poet as the first book that I read. And this fucking book, Iron Flame, took me so long to get through because I just wasn't enjoying it at all, that it ruined my entire month of January. I started this book towards the end of December, and I only finished it yesterday, and it is the 27th of January today. I am typically quite a fast reader. If I'm into a book, I can finish it very quickly. That is my first point about this book. It was boring. It was so boring. I can't even say it's middle book syndrome because this is supposed to be a 5-book series. So if book 2 is already this boring, if you need that much filler to get it to a 5-book series, it doesn't need to be a 5-book series. And that is what this book felt like, just filler. This is gonna have some spoilers because it's the second book in the series, so it kind of needs to have spoilers for Fourth Wing to be able to talk about it properly. So if you haven't read them yet and you care about spoilers, skip to wherever this is. So I appreciate there are some elements of the political landscape and stuff like that that could not have been explained in the previous book, because in the previous book Violet wasn't aware of all of these things. She wasn't aware of the political corruption and lies that the government had told, her own mother had told, so there needed to be explanation in this book. However, one of the biggest things that I noticed was just things feeling like they were trying to be too clever or complex. There needed to then be so much more explanation. There needed to be so much more just unnecessary shit in it that actually it didn't need to be like that. Again, I'm gonna compare this to the Shadow and Bone series again, because that is genuinely a very good YA fantasy series, so I'm going to compare it to that. Shadow and Bone had a lot going on, but I don't think it was overly complex in the actual conflict and what it was trying to achieve. And the way it was written allows you to understand what was happening and also have clues and hints of what was probably going to come next. Iron Flame didn't have that. it was because there was so much suddenly happening and all of this stuff that hadn't been explained properly. When Violet suddenly came to a realization of something, I was just sat there like, what does that, I don't understand what you've just worked out, because this hasn't been set up properly. Not because I'm stupid, because it hasn't been set up in a way for me to understand what's happening without you then needing to have a full exposition conversation with someone to explain it. That shouldn't need to happen. It was a lot of not a lot happening, then suddenly conversations where things are realised that don't make sense, and then not a lot happening again. And a lot of the time that was filled with that was just Violet's repetitive, whiny, annoying internal monologue. So like the first half of this book is just unnecessary conflict and arguments between her and Xaden, the love interest. She was being fucking stupid. He was also being fucking stupid. They're both stupid. It just dragged on for so long. And the main crux of it is he didn't tell her about this revolution and plot to try and solve the problem that the government were trying to cover up. And she's pissed at him that he didn't tell her. And I think this is just one of those classic female main character YA tropes of your relationship has literally been going on for about 2 minutes. You are the daughter of the general of the government's army. Why the fuck would he tell you? And why are you annoyed? Just please get over it. I don't need 300 pages of you whining about it. There was so much drama in this book and conflict between characters that was incredibly unnecessary, and again, I didn't understand why it was happening. There was one argument that her and Xaden were having. Literally could not tell you what they were arguing about or why they were arguing. There was no build up to it, no real point that either of them had. It was honestly just felt like it was there because the rest of the book was so boring that it needed these unnecessary points of drama to keep it going. I don't particularly think any of this conflict or the things that her and Xaden were clearly struggling with themselves even really added to any character development. It almost felt like their characters regressed, especially Violet's. At the beginning of Fourth Wing, Violet was irritating, whiny, annoying. I hated her. And she's just full circled back to that. Any character development that was in the first book, erased, gone, thrown in the bin. We're back to irritating 2012 characters. The plot wasn't interesting. All of the characters reverted and became awful, so I didn't care about them either. Things hadn't been built up in a way that I was intrigued or wanting to know what's happening. So really, I didn't care what happened, nor did I particularly want to keep reading, but I'm stubborn and don't DNF books, so I persevered for a month so I could finish it. Finally, I think one of the big selling points of this series is it's fantasy, there's dragons, there's a hot, broody guy who can wield shadows, and there's smut in it. That is the big part of it. And honestly, the smut scenes in this book were cringe as fuck. Like, I was about to say I've read better on Wattpad. This would fit better in the Wattpad sphere. It was so clear that Rebecca Yarros was attempting to give Xaden all of these like lines that like people would quote and be like, oh my god, that's so hot. They were embarrassing. I was sat there like, this is just awful. I think that's an overarching problem that I have with this series, is that it's written as if it's YA. It's written like I said, something I would have read as a teenager, but then there's just all of these spicy scenes in it. So it's like, it's trying to be new adult, but it's not written like that. It's very much juvenile in its plot, characters and writing. And so the demographic it's trying to target, I don't know what age range new adult is, but that age range, for me personally, it just doesn't hit that mark because the characters feel immature, and I've read better, far better. It's not good. Those are my thoughts and problems with the overall, with each individual book. The series as a whole, I think it comes down to some of the things I've already said. Firstly, I don't understand how this is going to be 5 books. Genuinely no idea, because as I said previously, if Iron Flame was already that boring and full of unnecessary drama and filler that really didn't need to be there, what is going to happen in the next 3 books that is actually going to be important to the story or worth reading? I don't think there's going to be a lot, personally. Bearing in mind, Fourth Wing was 498 pages. Iron Flame was, I think, like 620. Yeah, 623 pages. Those are big books, right? Are they just going to keep getting longer? Are they going to be the same length? What are you putting in those that is actually gonna be worth reading? Because if it's already feeling like filler at book 2, that's not really a good sign to me that it's gonna keep up the pace or gonna remotely hold interest in it. Six of Crows, 491 pages. Crooked Kingdom, I've just checked but I've forgotten, 500 and something. This is a completed fantasy series that is shorter than the first 2 books in a 5-book series. More happens in terms of plot development, more happens in terms of character development, more happens in terms of world building. Admittedly, with Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, there's not as much world building because that was already kind of done in was already kind of done in Shadow and Bone. And when I say there was more, I don't mean there has to be a lot happening or going on in a book for it to be good, but you need to hold interest, and things that are there need to be purposeful and there for a reason. That is why I keep coming back and comparing it to Shadow and Bone or the Grishaverse, because everything that's there is purposeful and for a reason. And even Rule of Wolves and King of Scars, which I feel like are probably actually a better comparison to these books because they were very political and I did struggle with them. Even those, something was always happening to keep the story going, and it was there for a reason, and things were set up in a way that made sense. This just doesn't feel like that. This just feels like something that people are talking about a lot at the moment, which is reading becoming like fast fashion, and that is what this feels like to me. I appreciate it's got a huge following, and I do appreciate that the author may not feel like this and probably has put a lot of love into this series, but it doesn't feel like it. I don't think these books are good quality. I don't think they're well written. I think, you know, there was so many publishing errors, quality errors with Iron Flame. I think there is occasional parts which you think, oh, okay, that was well written, but a lot of it is just kind of meh. There are some parts of it, like I mentioned, that are just awkward and cringy to read. This series is trying to be something it's not. You know, slash all the smart out of it. Doesn't need to be there, honestly. There's no real narrative reason for it to be there. Slash all of that out of it and just commit to it being YA, and it would honestly probably be better, because at least then you're getting what you expect. Whereas now it feels like it should be more mature than it is. A lot of that comes from the world building feeling incomplete, and a lot of that comes from the characters just feeling incredibly immature. The more I read Iron Flame specifically, the more annoyed I got, and also the more I realised this series is just not for me. And I know I said at the beginning, some people really like this series, that's fine, like what you like. If you really enjoy this, then by all means keep buying more. I don't know if I will, honestly. Like I said, I'm the kind of stubborn that wants to see something through, but I don't know if I can put myself through another 3 books of this if they're gonna be like anything like Iron Flame. All in all, my thoughts on the series are I probably won't continue it, but you know, by the time the next one comes out, maybe I will have forgotten how much I absolutely hated Iron Flame, and because I'm stubborn, will make myself read it, but we'll see. I personally wouldn't recommend these books, honestly. I know I said I'm not really reading a lot of fantasy anymore, but I think there are better fantasy books out there. You know, read what you want, enjoy it if you want to enjoy it, but personally, I don't think these deserve the hype that they got. If you are a fantasy reader and you have, you know, recommendations of fantasy books that you feel like are underrated or overlooked that are genuinely really good, I would be really interested to hear, because I think the reason I have been moving away from fantasy is because I feel like this trend of romantasy and poor quality books, it's just taking over more and more, and it's making me not want to read them, because it feels like I've read the same book about 20 times at this point, and they're just cut and paste template with slightly different character names, slightly different world, slightly different powers, and you're done. So if you have any recommendations of genuinely good ones that don't fall into that mold, I'd be really interested to know. I would also like to know what you feel about this series, honestly, because I know it has very, very mixed opinions, and Iron Flame specifically, I think, got quite mixed reviews. So let me know, just be nice about it. And remember, this is just an opinion, and we are all allowed our own opinions when it comes to books. Thank you as always for watching. I hope wherever you are, you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you very soon. Bye guys.